The funeral parlor smelled of lilies and broken promises. I stood in the corner, clutching my grandmother's handwritten recipe card for her famous peach cobbler, watching my family act like I didn't exist. My cousin Jessica was sobbing dramatically at the front row, her perfectly curled blonde hair catching the light as she accepted condolences from neighbors who had no idea she hadn't visited Grandma Ruth in over 2 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Thank you for coming, Jessica whispered to Mrs. Patterson from down the street, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Grandma meant everything to our family. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell everyone in that room that I was the one who held Grandma's hand through her chemotherapy appointments. I was the one who drove 3 hours every weekend from my apartment in Portland to her little house in Salem, Oregon, just to make sure she wasn't alone. But as usual, I stayed silent. My Aunt Margaret glanced over at me with those cold blue eyes that had dismissed me my entire life. She leaned over to whisper something to my Uncle Frank, and they both looked at me like I was some unwelcome stranger who had wandered into their grief. That's when I heard it, the words that would change everything. "What's she even doing here?" Margaret's voice carried further than she intended. "Sarah was never really part of this family anyway. She's nothing to us." Nothing. The word hit me like a physical blow. After 28 years of being their invisible support system, their backup plan, their last resort, I was nothing to them. But Grandma Ruth knew better, and in just a few hours, they would too. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I've been the family ghost for as long as I can remember. While my cousin Jessica got the spotlight for every achievement, her high school valedictorian speech, her nursing degree, her picture-perfect wedding to Dr. Richard Coleman, I was the one in the background, working double shifts as a medical technician at Portland General Hospital, sending money home whenever there was a crisis. And there were always crises. When Uncle Frank lost his job at the lumber mill 3 years ago, who do you think kept the lights on in his house? When Jessica needed help with her wedding dress alterations because she'd gained weight and couldn't afford a professional seamstress, who spent her vacation days hunched over a sewing machine? When Grandma Ruth's prescription costs skyrocketed after her cancer diagnosis, who quietly set up automatic payments to the pharmacy? Me. Always me. Sarah, the reliable one. Sarah, the one who never asked for anything in return. But I was never really seen, not the way Jessica was seen. The family dynamics had been carved in stone since childhood. Jessica was the golden granddaughter, beautiful, charming, destined for greatness. She lived just 30 minutes away from Grandma Ruth in the same small town of Salem where 3 generations of our family had put down roots. She was the one who brought boyfriends to family dinners, who got her photos displayed on Grandma's mantle, who received the loudest applause at every birthday party. I was the one who lived in Portland, an hour and a half away, working in a sterile hospital laboratory, coming home to a quiet 1-bedroom apartment with plants that were easier to care for than relationships. I was the responsible one, the boring one, the one who never took any risks, according to Aunt Margaret's constant commentary. What they didn't know was that I took the biggest risk of all. I kept loving them despite getting nothing in return. The pattern started when I was 16. My parents had died in a car accident on Interstate 5 during a winter storm, and I went to live with Grandma Ruth. Jessica's family, Aunt Margaret and Uncle Frank, took me in legally, but emotionally, I was always the outsider looking in. They had their own daughter to focus on, their own family unit to protect. I was the obligation, the reminder of tragedy, the extra mouth to feed. But Grandma Ruth saw me differently. She would sit with me on her back porch, teaching me to can peaches from her orchard, telling me stories about my mother's childhood, making me feel like I belonged somewhere. When I graduated high school with honors, she was the only one who came to the ceremony. When I got my medical technician certification, she framed my certificate and hung it in her kitchen. "You're going to do important things, Sarah," she'd tell me, her weathered hands holding mine. "You have a heart that sees people's pain and wants to heal it. That's a gift." The financial support started small, $20 here, $50 there, but as I established myself in my career, as my salary increased, so did their expectations. Uncle Frank's gambling problem, because yes, that's where his paychecks really went, not bad luck at the lumber mill, became my responsibility. Jessica's credit card debt from her shopping addiction became my problem to solve. Grandma Ruth's medical bills became my monthly budget priority. I kept detailed records in a small notebook I hid in my bedroom drawer. Over the past 5 years, I had sent home over $60,000. $60,000 that I could have used for a down payment on a house, for traveling, for building a life of my own. Instead, I lived in a cramped apartment with secondhand furniture, driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic, while Jessica posted Instagram photos of her new BMW. The most painful part wasn't the money, it was the invisibility. At family gatherings, I would sit at the dinner table listening to them praise Jessica's latest accomplishment, while my contributions went unmentioned. When Jessica got engaged, they threw her a lavish engagement party that I helped fund. When she bought her first house, they celebrated with champagne, while I quietly arranged the loan that made her down payment possible. "Sarah's so practical," they'd say, as if being practical was a character flaw. "She's not really the type to get married or have kids. She's more focused on her career." What they meant was, Sarah is convenient, Sarah is useful, Sarah will always be there when we need her, so we don't have to worry about her needs. But Grandma Ruth knew the truth. During her final months, when the cancer was winning and I was driving to Salem every weekend, she would tell me things that nobody else heard. "They don't deserve you, sweetheart," she whispered one afternoon as I helped her organize her medication. "You've got the biggest heart in this family, and they're too blind to see it." "I just want to help," I told her, adjusting her pillows. "They're all I have left." She shook her head, her gray eyes sharp despite her illness. "No, Sarah, you're all they have left. They just don't know it yet." The day before she passed, Grandma Ruth asked me to bring her jewelry box from her bedroom. Inside was a collection of modest pieces. Her wedding ring, a pearl necklace from her mother, a silver bracelet I'd given her for her 70th birthday. She picked up a simple gold locket that had belonged to her grandmother. "This is yours now," she said, fastening it around my neck. "It's been passed down through 4 generations of strong women. You're the next one to carry it." "Grandma, I can't take this," I protested. "It should go to Jessica or to Aunt Margaret." She squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "No, Sarah. This goes to the woman who understands what it means to love unconditionally. That's you." I wore that locket to her funeral, hidden beneath my black dress, feeling its weight against my chest like a secret between us. As I watched my family perform their grief for the mourners, as I listened to Jessica's eulogy that mentioned her special bond with Grandma Ruth, as I heard Aunt Margaret's speech about how family is everything, I touched the locket and remembered Grandma's words. "You're all they have left, they just don't know it yet." Standing in that funeral parlor, labeled as nothing by the people I had sacrificed everything for, I realized that Grandma Ruth had been preparing me for this moment. She had seen what I was too hurt to see, that being overlooked wasn't my failure, it was their loss. The lawyer's business card was tucked in my purse, his message from that morning still fresh in my mind. "Please stay after the service, Miss Mitchell. There are some matters regarding your grandmother's estate that require your immediate attention." I had no idea what that meant. I assumed it was some small keepsake, maybe a few $100s. I never imagined that in less than an hour, everything would change. As the funeral director began closing the casket, I stepped forward to say my final goodbye. I placed the peach cobbler recipe card on Grandma Ruth's folded hands and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me." Behind me, I heard Aunt Margaret's sharp intake of breath. "What is she doing up there? This is family time." But I wasn't nothing. I was about to become everything. And they were about to learn the difference. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The funeral reception was held at the Salem Community Center, a modest building where Grandma Ruth had volunteered every Tuesday for the past 15 years, serving meals to families who couldn't afford groceries. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a woman who had spent her final years giving to strangers, while her own family fought over who deserved the most sympathy. I stood near the dessert table, watching Jessica hold court with a group of Grandma's church friends. She was telling them about the special moments she'd shared with Grandma Ruth, conveniently forgetting to mention that most of those moments had happened when I was the one who arranged transportation, paid for her gas, or covered her shift at the hospital so she could visit. She always said I reminded her of herself when she was young, Jessica was saying, her voice carrying that practiced sadness that she'd perfected over the past 3 days. We had such a deep connection, I think she saw her legacy continuing through me. Mrs. Henderson from the church nodded sympathetically. Ruth was so proud of you, dear. She talked about your nursing career all the time. What Mrs. Henderson didn't know was that Jessica had been struggling at the hospital for months. 3 weeks ago, she'd called me in tears, explaining that she was on probation for medication errors and might lose her job. She needed money for a lawyer to help her fight the accusations. Without hesitation, I'd transferred $3,000 from my savings account. Please don't tell anyone, she'd begged. If this gets out, it'll destroy my reputation. I'd kept her secret, just like I'd kept all their secrets. Uncle Frank's gambling debts. Aunt Margaret's affair with her neighbor 2 summers ago. Jessica's prescription pill addiction that had started after her car accident last year. I was the family's unofficial confessor, the one they turned to when their perfect facades began to crack. But I was also the one who fixed their problems while they took credit for their recoveries. The lawyer, Mr. James Whitmore, had been watching me from across the room. He was a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been Grandma Ruth's attorney for over 20 years, and I'd met him twice during her final months, when she'd needed help updating her healthcare directives. He approached me quietly, his voice low and professional. Miss Mitchell, I hope you received my message about staying after the service. I nodded, suddenly nervous. Yes, but I'm not sure why you need to see me specifically. Shouldn't the family meeting include everyone? Mr. Whitmore glanced around the room, then back at me. There are some unique circumstances regarding your grandmother's estate. I think it would be best to discuss them privately first. Before I could ask what he meant, Aunt Margaret appeared at my elbow, her perfume overwhelming in the small space. She was dressed in an expensive black suit that I knew she couldn't afford on Uncle Frank's unemployment benefits, which meant she'd probably used the money I'd sent for their mortgage payment last month. Mr. Whitmore, she said with forced brightness. I was hoping to speak with you. I assume you'll be reading Mother's will tomorrow? We should probably discuss the arrangements for the house. Frank and I have been thinking we might move back to take care of the property. The lawyer's expression remained neutral. Mrs. Collins, I'll be meeting with the beneficiaries as outlined in Mrs. Carter's will. All relevant parties will be notified. Well, naturally, that would be family, Margaret continued, shooting me a meaningful look. Jessica, Frank, and myself. We are her closest relatives after all. I felt my cheeks burn. Even at Grandma Ruth's funeral, I was being dismissed as irrelevant. But Mr. Whitmore surprised me by saying, Actually, Mrs. Collins, Miss Mitchell is specifically named in the will and must be present for the reading. Margaret's smile faltered. Oh, well, I suppose that makes sense. Ruth always had a soft spot for strays. Strays? The word hit me like a slap, but before I could respond, Jessica appeared beside her mother, her face flushed from accepting condolences. What are we talking about? She asked, linking her arm through mine with false affection. Poor Sarah looks so tired. You've been working so hard lately, haven't you? What she meant was, you've been working so hard to pay for my legal fees, my mother's shopping addiction, and my father's gambling debts. But she couldn't say that in front of the lawyer. I'm fine, I said quietly, gently extracting my arm from her grip, just processing everything. Jessica's eyes suddenly filled with tears. Real ones this time. I can't believe she's gone. Grandma Ruth was like a mother to me after my parents got divorced. She understood me in ways that nobody else did. I almost choked on my frustration. Jessica's parents weren't divorced. They were standing 15 feet away, bickering quietly about the cost of the funeral flowers. But Jessica had a habit of rewriting history when it suited her emotional needs. She was special to all of us, I managed to say, touching the locket beneath my dress. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat. Miss Mitchell, would it be possible to speak with you privately before you leave today, perhaps in the church office? Margaret's eyes sharpened. Is there a problem with the will? I mean, surely there aren't any complications. Mother's affairs were always very straightforward. Not a problem, the lawyer assured her. Just some details that need clarification. As Mr. Whitmore walked away, Margaret turned to me with suspicion in her eyes. "What did you do, Sarah? Did you influence her somehow? Fill her head with ideas about changing her will?" The accusation stung because it was so ridiculous. I'd never asked Grandma Ruth for anything except her company. Our conversations had been about books, gardening, her memories of my mother, her concerns about the family's future, never about money or inheritance. "I didn't do anything," I said firmly. "I just spent time with her." "Exactly," Margaret snapped. "You isolated her from the rest of us, made her think we didn't care." Jessica jumped in, her voice rising. "That's not fair, Mom. Sarah was just being helpful." But her defense felt hollow, especially when she immediately followed it with, "Though I do think it's strange that she's being called to a private meeting. What could Grandma possibly have left her that the rest of us don't know about?" The truth was, I had no idea. Grandma Ruth had been secretive about her finances. I knew she owned her house outright, a small 2-bedroom cottage with a large garden that she'd maintained herself until the cancer made it impossible. I knew she had some savings, probably enough to cover her funeral expenses with a little left over. I assumed she'd leave the house to Margaret, as her only daughter, and maybe split whatever savings remained between Jessica and me. But the way Mr. Whitmore was acting suggested something more complicated. The reception began winding down as the afternoon stretched on. I helped clean up the folding chairs and wash the coffee cups, just as I'd helped clean up after every family gathering for the past 12 years. Jessica and her parents sat at a corner table, speaking in low voices and occasionally glancing in my direction. I could imagine their conversation. They were probably wondering what I might have manipulated Grandma Ruth into leaving me. Maybe they were worried about her jewelry, or her china set, or the few $1,000s they assumed she had in her checking account. They had no idea about the extent of Grandma Ruth's financial awareness. They didn't know that she'd been quietly watching their spending habits, tracking their requests for money, noticing patterns that they thought they were hiding. 3 months ago, during one of my weekend visits, Grandma Ruth had asked me to help her organize her financial documents. We'd spent an afternoon going through bank statements, insurance policies, and investment accounts that I didn't even know existed. "I've been more careful with money than people realize," she'd told me, pointing to a portfolio statement that made my eyes widen. "Your grandfather left me well provided for, and I've been adding to it for 30 years. But I've also been watching how this family handles money, and I'm not impressed." She'd shown me a notebook where she'd been recording every financial request from family members, every loan that was never repaid, every crisis that mysteriously required exactly the amount of money I'd just sent home. "They think I'm a foolish old woman who doesn't notice things," she'd said, her voice sharp with intelligence. "But I see everything, Sarah. I see who gives and who takes. I see who visits because they love me, and who visits because they need something." At the time, I'd thought she was just venting frustration about Uncle Frank's gambling or Margaret's shopping sprees. I never imagined she was preparing for something bigger. As the last of the funeral guests left, Mr. Whitmore approached me again. "Miss Mitchell, are you ready for our conversation?" I nodded, following him to the small office behind the church sanctuary. He closed the door and gestured for me to sit in one of the 2 chairs, facing a modest wooden desk. "I want to be transparent with you," he began, settling into his chair and opening a leather briefcase. "Your grandmother's will is going to come as a shock to your family. She spent considerable time over the past year making changes, and she was very specific about her reasoning." My heart began to race. What kind of changes? He pulled out a thick document and set it on the desk between us. "Before we discuss the specifics, I need you to understand something. Your grandmother wasn't just aware of the financial support you've been providing to your family. She was documenting it. She asked me to help her track the money flows, to understand exactly how much you were sacrificing for people who didn't appreciate it." I felt my face flush. She knew. She knew everything, Sarah. The $60,000 over 5 years. The $3,000 you sent Jessica last month for her legal troubles. The $1,500 you gave Frank for his, quote, car repairs that actually went to the casino. The monthly payments to Margaret's credit card company. I stared at him in shock. How did she? She may have been elderly, but she wasn't naive. She had me run financial background checks on everyone in the family. She wanted to understand why you were always working extra shifts, why you never bought yourself anything nice, why you still lived in that small apartment while everyone else seemed to be doing better. The room felt like it was spinning. She was investigating my family? She was protecting you, Mr. Whitmore said gently, and she was making sure that her legacy went to the person who truly deserved it. He opened the will to a page marked with a yellow sticky note. Sarah, your grandmother has left you everything. The house, the savings accounts, the investment portfolio, the life insurance policy, all of it. I couldn't breathe. Everything? But what about Margaret? What about Jessica? They're mentioned in the will, he said carefully, but not as beneficiaries. They're specifically excluded, with detailed explanations of why. My hands were shaking as I tried to process this information. How much? I mean, what exactly did she have? Mr. Whitmore consulted another document. The total estate value is approximately $450,000. The house is worth about $200,000. And the rest is in various savings and investment accounts that she'd been building for decades. $450,000. More money than I'd ever dreamed of having. More than enough to change my entire life. But why? I whispered. Why would she do this? He smiled sadly. Because she said you were the only one who loved her without expecting anything in return. Because she watched you sacrifice your own happiness for people who took you for granted. Because she wanted to make sure that for once in your life, you were the one being taken care of. I thought about Jessica's sob story to the church ladies, about Margaret's assumption that she'd inherit the house, about Uncle Frank's plans to use whatever inheritance he received to pay off his gambling debts. They had no idea what was coming. When will you tell them? I asked. Tomorrow morning. I've scheduled a formal reading at my office. They're expecting a simple distribution of a modest estate. He paused. I have to warn you, Sarah, this is going to destroy your relationships with them. They're going to be angry, hurt, and probably vindictive. Are you prepared for that? I touched the locket at my throat and thought about Grandma Ruth's words. You're all they have left. They just don't know it yet. Maybe it was time they learned what they'd really lost. I'm ready, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. But I wasn't ready for what was about to happen. I wasn't ready for the fury, the accusations, the desperate attempts to contest the will. I wasn't ready to discover just how deep their entitlement ran, or how quickly love could turn to hatred when money was involved. Most of all, I wasn't ready to learn that standing up for myself would cost me the only family I'd ever known. But sometimes, the most important lessons are the ones that hurt the most. That evening, I drove back to my apartment in Portland through a heavy October rain. The windshield wipers of my Honda Civic struggled against the downpour, their rhythmic scraping matching the chaos in my mind. $450,000. The number kept echoing in my head like a song I couldn't stop humming. I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, a modest building called Riverside Gardens, that was neither by a river nor particularly garden-like. As I climbed the stairs to my second-floor unit, I could hear Mrs. Chen's television through the thin walls and smell the curry that Mr. Patel was cooking 3 doors down. This had been my world for the past 6 years. Predictable, quiet, safe. Tomorrow, everything would change. My apartment felt smaller than usual as I hung up my black funeral dress and changed into my favorite pajamas. Soft flannel pants with cartoon cats that Jessica had once mocked as pathetic for a woman your age. I made a cup of chamomile tea and sat at my tiny kitchen table, staring at the business card Mr. Whitmore had given me. The reality of what was about to happen hit me in waves. My family, the people I'd spent my entire adult life supporting, protecting, and loving despite their indifference, were about to discover that everything they'd assumed about their future was wrong. More than that, they were about to learn that the person they'd consistently dismissed as nothing was now everything. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Hey cousin, hope you're doing okay after today. I know funerals are hard for someone like you who doesn't handle emotions well. Let's grab coffee this weekend and catch up, Red Heart. Someone like you who doesn't handle emotions well. Even in her attempt at kindness, Jessica couldn't resist a subtle dig. She'd always painted me as emotionally stunted, too logical and practical to understand the complexities of human feelings. What she didn't realize was that I felt everything. I just learned to process pain quietly instead of broadcasting it for sympathy. I set the phone aside and walked to my bedroom closet, where I kept a small fireproof box behind my winter coats. Inside were my most important documents: my birth certificate, my parents' death certificates, my college diplomas, and a manila envelope marked family expenses in my neat handwriting. I'd started keeping records 3 years ago when Uncle Frank's requests for money became frequent enough to feel suspicious. What had begun as simple curiosity had evolved into detailed documentation of every financial transaction, every emergency, every crisis that somehow required my intervention. The numbers were staggering when seen all together. Beyond the $60,000 Mr. Whitmore had mentioned, there were smaller amounts I'd forgotten about. Groceries when Margaret's food stamps ran out, Jessica's car insurance when she'd let it lapse, medical copays when Uncle Frank claimed his unemployment didn't cover his prescriptions. But it wasn't just money. I'd given them my time, my energy, my emotional bandwidth. I'd rearranged my work schedule countless times to drive them to appointments, help them move, attend their events. I'd listened to their problems, kept their secrets, celebrated their victories, and comforted them through their failures. And through it all, I'd remained invisible. I pulled out a photograph that I kept at the bottom of the envelope, a picture from last Christmas at Grandma Ruth's house. The whole family was gathered around her dining table, smiling at the camera. Jessica sat next to Grandma Ruth, her arm around the elderly woman's shoulders. Margaret and Frank flanked them on either side, looking proud and content. I was at the far end of the table, partially cut off by the frame, my smile forced and my eyes tired. What the photo didn't show was that I'd paid for half the Christmas dinner, driven 4 hours in a snowstorm to get there, and spent the morning cooking while everyone else slept in. It didn't show that I'd given Jessica $200 the week before so she could buy presents for everyone, or that I'd quietly handled Grandma Ruth's prescription pickup so she wouldn't have to admit to the family that her medication costs were overwhelming her budget. Looking at that photo now, I could see what Grandma Ruth must have seen. A young woman who'd made herself small so others could shine, who'd sacrificed her own happiness to maintain the illusion of family harmony. My laptop chimed with an email notification. The sender was Margaret, and the subject line made my stomach clench. Family meeting tomorrow. Sarah, Frank and I have been discussing Mother's estate situation, and we think it would be best if we all went to the lawyer's office together tomorrow as a united family. Jessica suggested we meet for breakfast first at Denny's on Oak Street at 9 a.m. to discuss how we want to handle things. We know you're probably expecting some small token from Mother's estate, and that's fine. She always had a soft spot for you, but we need to be realistic about the situation. Frank and I have been struggling financially, and Jessica is still building her career. We're hoping you'll be understanding about the family's needs. We've already spoken to a real estate agent about Mother's house. The market is good right now, and we think we can get a fair price if we sell quickly. Of course, we'll make sure you get a small percentage since you helped out sometimes with her bills. See you tomorrow morning. And Sarah, please don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. Family should stick together during difficult times. Love, Aunt Margaret. I read the email 3 times, my anger building with each pass. They'd already contacted a real estate agent. They'd already decided how to distribute an estate they knew nothing about. And they'd done it all without consulting me, the person who'd actually been present for Grandma Ruth's final months. The phrase, helped out sometimes with her bills, was particularly infuriating. $60,000 wasn't helping out sometimes. It was single-handedly keeping their family afloat while they pursued their own interests. But what struck me most was the assumption that I'd be understanding about the family's needs. For 12 years, I'd been understanding, I'd been accommodating. I'd been the reliable safety net that allowed them to take risks, make mistakes, and live beyond their means. Tomorrow, they'd learn what it felt like to have that safety net removed. I closed my laptop and walked to my bathroom mirror, studying my reflection. At 28, I looked older than my years. The stress of constant worry about other people's problems had carved fine lines around my eyes. My brown hair was pulled back in the same practical ponytail I'd worn since college, and my clothes were always sensible, never stylish. When was the last time I'd bought something just because I wanted it? When was the last time I'd taken a vacation, gone out with friends, or spent money on myself, without calculating how it would impact my ability to help my family? I thought about the life I could have had with the money I'd given them. I could have bought a house, traveled to Europe, maybe even gone back to school for my master's degree. Instead, I'd chosen to be their financial foundation, their emotional support system, their backup plan. And they'd repaid me by calling me nothing. My phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. Jessica's name appeared on the screen, along with a photo of her from last summer's family barbecue, the one I'd hosted and paid for while she took credit for organizing. "Hey Sarah," she said when I answered, her voice artificially cheerful. "I just wanted to check on you again. You seemed a little distant at the funeral today." "I'm fine," I replied, settling onto my couch, "just tired." "I can imagine. You've been working so hard lately." There was a pause, and I could hear her calculating her next words. "Listen, I talked to Mom and Dad about tomorrow's meeting with the lawyer. We're all a little nervous about what Grandma might have left behind. You know how she was about money. Never really organized about anything." The irony of Jessica calling Grandma Ruth disorganized was rich, considering that Jessica herself couldn't balance a checkbook without overdrawing her account. "We just want to make sure we handle everything fairly," Jessica continued. "You know, as a family. We're thinking it might be best to pool whatever she left and use it to pay off some of the family debts first, then split whatever's remaining. That way, everyone benefits equally." Pool whatever she left. The audacity was breathtaking. They wanted to use Grandma Ruth's inheritance to pay off debts that I'd been covering for years, then split what remained, as if they'd all contributed equally to her care. "Sarah, are you there?" "I'm here," I said quietly. "So you'll be at breakfast tomorrow morning? We really need to present a united front to the lawyer. You know how these legal people can be. They'll try to complicate things if we seem divided." I thought about Mr. Whitmore's kind eyes and gentle manner. He wasn't trying to complicate anything. He was trying to honor the wishes of a woman who'd seen through their facades and decided to reward the one person who'd loved her unconditionally. "I'll be at the lawyer's office," I said, "but I won't be at breakfast." "Oh," Jessica's voice sharpened slightly. "Why not? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong. I just have some things to take care of first." "What kind of things?" "Sarah, you're not planning to say something stupid to the lawyer, are you? Because that would be really selfish. This inheritance isn't just about you." There it was, the assumption that I was too naive, too emotional, too stupid to handle an adult conversation with an attorney. The assumption that anything I might say would be selfish, despite 12 years of evidence to the contrary. "I'll see you at the lawyer's office, Jessica." "Sarah, wait." I hung up and turned off my phone. The apartment fell silent except for the rain still pattering against my windows. I made another cup of tea and sat on my small balcony under the covered overhang, watching the water run off the roof in steady streams. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a different life. What would it feel like to wake up on a Saturday morning without immediately calculating how much money I could afford to send home? What would it be like to buy a new car without worrying about whether Uncle Frank might need help with his rent? What would it mean to make decisions based on my own dreams instead of their crises? Grandma Ruth had given me more than money. She'd given me permission to choose myself. She'd validated what I'd been too afraid to acknowledge, that love shouldn't require bankruptcy, that family shouldn't demand invisibility, that generosity shouldn't come at the cost of self-respect. I pulled the locket from beneath my pajama top and opened it. Inside was a tiny photograph of my mother as a young woman, her face bright with hope and possibility. Grandma Ruth had told me once that I had my mother's eyes, kind but strong, gentle but determined. "Tomorrow," I whispered to the photo, "I'm going to find out who I really am when I stop trying to be what everyone else needs." The rain continued through the night, washing the streets clean. By morning, the world would look different. By tomorrow afternoon, everything I'd known about my place in this family would be transformed. I was about to learn that sometimes the greatest gift isn't what you receive, it's what you finally stop giving away. I arrived at James Whitmore & Associates at exactly 10:45 a.m., 15 minutes before our scheduled appointment. The law office was housed in a converted Victorian mansion on Salem's historic Main Street, its burgundy exterior and brass nameplate exuding the kind of old-money respectability that Aunt Margaret would have found intimidating under normal circumstances. Today wasn't normal circumstances. I sat in my Honda Civic for a few minutes, watching the rain from the night before evaporate into wisps of steam on the pavement. The morning sun felt warm through my windshield, and for the first time in months, I felt something resembling peace. I'd chosen a navy blue dress for today, not funeral black, but something that made me feel professional and confident. I'd even put on makeup and styled my hair, small acts of self-care that felt revolutionary after years of practical ponytails and chapstick. My phone had been buzzing all morning with increasingly frantic messages from my family. Jessica had called 4 times, her voicemails progressing from concerned to annoyed to borderline hostile. The last one, left at 9:30 a.m., had been particularly telling. "Sarah, this is ridiculous. We're all at Denny's waiting for you, and you're making everyone uncomfortable. Mom is worried that you're having some kind of breakdown, and honestly, your behavior is really selfish right now. We're trying to handle Grandma's death like adults, and you're acting like a child. Just call me back, okay? We need to present a united front in an hour, and right now you're making that impossible." A united front. As if we'd ever been united about anything that didn't directly benefit them. I turned off my phone and slipped it into my purse alongside the manila envelope containing my financial records. Mr. Whitmore had suggested I bring documentation of my contributions to the family, just in case there were any challenges to the will. Looking at those numbers this morning, the careful accounting of 12 years of silent sacrifice had filled me with a strange combination of sadness and vindication. $63,412. That was the total I'd calculated last night, including the smaller amounts I'd initially forgotten. Enough for a down payment on a house, a reliable car, and a comfortable emergency fund. Instead, it had disappeared into the black hole of my family's financial irresponsibility, never to be acknowledged or repaid. The front door of the law office opened, and Margaret emerged, scanning the street with sharp eyes. She was dressed in her best attempt at sophistication. A black blazer that looked expensive until you noticed the loose thread on the cuff and the slight fading that suggested it had been purchased secondhand. Her heels clicked against the wet pavement as she spotted my car and marched over with the determined stride of someone accustomed to getting her way. I rolled down my window as she approached, her face a mask of controlled irritation. "There you are," she said, leaning down to peer at me through the window. "We've been looking everywhere for you. Jessica thought maybe you'd gotten in an accident or something." "I'm fine," I replied calmly. "I told Jessica I wouldn't be at breakfast." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Yes, she mentioned that. Very inconsiderate, Sarah. We're trying to coordinate as a family, and you're off doing what exactly? What was so important that you couldn't join us for one meal?" I could see Frank and Jessica approaching from across the street, their body language tense with frustration. Frank walked with the slightly unsteady gait of someone who'd already had a drink this morning, probably to calm his nerves about the will reading. Jessica was practically vibrating with anxiety, her perfectly manicured nails already bitten down to the quick. "I needed some time to think," I said to Margaret, gathering my purse and stepping out of the car. "Time to think about what?" she pressed, falling into step beside me as we walked toward the office entrance. "Sarah, I hope you're not getting any strange ideas about this inheritance. I know you and Mother had a special relationship, but you need to be realistic about family obligations." Family obligations. The phrase that had governed my entire adult life, the invisible chain that had kept me tethered to their endless needs and demands. "What kind of strange ideas?" I asked, genuinely curious about her assumptions. Margaret glanced around nervously as Frank and Jessica caught up to us in front of the law office entrance. "Well, you know, sometimes people who aren't used to handling money can get overwhelmed by even small amounts. We just want to make sure you don't make any impulsive decisions that you'll regret later." Frank nodded vigorously, his breath already carrying the telltale scent of whiskey. "Exactly. Your aunt and I have been thinking, and we figure the smartest thing would be to set up some kind of trust situation. You know, where the family makes decisions together about how to use Mother's money. That way, nobody gets in over their head. A trust where they made decisions about money that wasn't theirs to begin with. The audacity was breathtaking, but not surprising. This was how they'd always operated. Assuming control over resources they hadn't earned, making plans for benefits they hadn't contributed to. Jessica moved closer, lowering her voice to what she probably thought was a compassionate tone. "Cousin, we're worried about you. You've been acting strange since the funeral, and we think maybe grief is affecting your judgment. It's totally normal. Lots of people make bad financial decisions when they're emotional." I almost laughed. Jessica was lecturing me about emotional decision-making when she'd blown $3,000 on a handbag collection last month, while asking me to cover her utilities. Frank was concerned about my judgment while hiding his gambling addiction. Margaret was worried about my money management skills while maxing out credit cards on home shopping networks. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but I think I can handle whatever Grandma Ruth left me." The three of them exchanged looks, the kind of pointed glances that excluded me from their unspoken communication. It was a familiar feeling, being on the outside of their family unit, but today it felt different. Today, I wasn't the desperate outsider trying to earn my way in. I was the person holding all the cards. Mr. Whitmore appeared in the doorway of the law office, his silver hair catching the morning light. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit, and his warm smile seemed to encompass all of us equally. "Good morning, everyone," he said, stepping aside to usher us into the building. "Thank you for coming. I know this is a difficult time for the family." The interior of the law office was exactly what I'd expected. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and the smell of old paper and furniture polish. We were led into a conference room, dominated by a massive mahogany table, surrounded by high-backed chairs. Margaret immediately moved to sit at the head of the table, with Frank and Jessica flanking her on either side. I took a seat across from them, feeling like I was facing a tribunal. Mr. Whitmore settled at the opposite head of the table, opening his briefcase and removing several documents. The will itself was surprisingly thick. Not the simple one-page document I'd expected, but a comprehensive legal document with multiple sections and addendums. "Before we begin," Mr. Whitmore said, adjusting his glasses, "I want to remind everyone that this is a formal legal proceeding. Mrs. Carter's will is quite detailed, and I'll be reading it in its entirety as required by Oregon state law." Margaret leaned forward eagerly. "Of course. We understand this is all very official. We just want to make sure Mother's wishes are carried out properly." "Indeed," the lawyer replied, his tone neutral. "Mrs. Carter spent considerable time over the past year ensuring that her wishes were very clearly articulated." He opened the will to the first page and began reading in his measured, professional voice. The opening paragraphs were standard legal language, identifying Grandma Ruth as Ruth Eleanor Carter, confirming her sound mind and legal capacity, revoking all previous wills. Margaret nodded along smugly, as if she were personally responsible for these formalities. Then Mr. Whitmore reached the substantive portions. "I, Ruth Eleanor Carter, being of sound mind and body, do hereby distribute my worldly possessions as follows." He paused, looking around the table. "To my daughter, Margaret Carter Collins, I leave my collection of ceramic angels and my recipe box, with the hope that she will remember the importance of giving without expecting recognition." Margaret's face lit up with satisfaction, though I could see the calculation in her eyes as she mentally tallied the value of ceramic collectibles. The recipe box was a nice touch, but clearly not the main event she was expecting. "To my son-in-law, Frank Collins, I leave my late husband's fishing equipment and tackle box, with the wish that he will find peace in honest pursuits rather than games of chance." Frank's smile faltered slightly at the pointed reference to games of chance, but he nodded graciously. He was probably already planning to sell the fishing gear to fund his next casino visit. "To my granddaughter, Jessica Collins Martinez, I leave my jewelry collection, excluding the gold locket which has been previously given to its intended recipient, with the hope that she will value substance over appearance in all aspects of her life." Jessica's eyes sparkled with delight. Grandma Ruth had owned some genuinely valuable pieces: her engagement ring, a pearl necklace from her mother, several gold bracelets that had been gifts over the years. Jessica was probably already planning which pieces to keep and which to sell. The three of them were practically glowing with satisfaction. They'd gotten exactly what they'd expected: personal items with sentimental and modest monetary value, distributed according to traditional family hierarchy. Then Mr. Whitmore turned the page. The remainder of my estate, including my house at 1247 Maple Street in Salem, Oregon, all bank accounts, investment portfolios, life insurance policies, and any other assets not specifically mentioned above, I leave in their entirety to my granddaughter, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's mouth fell open, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and rapidly mounting anger. Frank sat perfectly still, as if he hadn't understood the words. Jessica made a small choking sound, her hand flying to her throat. "I'm sorry," Margaret said finally, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Did you say the remainder of the estate goes to Sarah?" "That is correct," Mr. Whitmore confirmed, continuing to read. "Mrs. Carter has included a detailed explanation of her reasoning, which I'm required to read as part of the official record." He turned to another page, his voice taking on a more personal tone as he read Grandma Ruth's own words. "To my family, I want you to understand that this decision was not made lightly or in anger, but after careful observation and consideration. Over the past 5 years, I have watched Sarah sacrifice her own comfort and future to support a family that has consistently taken her for granted. While others have pursued their own interests and made poor financial decisions, Sarah has quietly shouldered the burden of keeping this family afloat." Margaret shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "This is ridiculous. Mother was clearly not in her right mind when she wrote this. Sarah has been manipulating her, filling her head with lies about the family." Mr. Whitmore raised a hand calmly. "Mrs. Collins, please sit down. I'm not finished reading the will. And there's more you need to hear." "I don't need to hear anything else," Margaret snapped, but Frank grabbed her arm and pulled her back into her chair. His face had gone pale, and I could see the wheels turning as he calculated exactly what this meant for his financial future. Mr. Whitmore continued reading Grandma Ruth's explanation. "I have documented evidence of Sarah's financial contributions to this family, over $60,000 in the past 5 years alone. Money that could have secured her own future, but which she freely gave to cover the consequences of poor decisions made by other family members. Frank's gambling debts, Margaret's shopping addiction, Jessica's medical bills and legal fees, all quietly handled by Sarah, while she worked extra shifts and lived in a modest apartment." Jessica found her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "That's not—" She never said anything about keeping track of money. "If we had known—" "Known what?" I asked quietly, speaking for the first time since we'd entered the room. "Known that I was documenting your request for money? Would that have changed anything?" "You were keeping records?" Frank demanded, his face flushing red. "Like some kind of loan shark? That's not how family works, Sarah." The hypocrisy was stunning. He was angry at me for keeping track of money he'd never intended to repay, as if documentation somehow made his borrowing less legitimate. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat and continued. "Most importantly, Sarah was the only family member who visited me regularly during my illness, not because she wanted something, but because she genuinely cared about my well-being. She drove 3 hours round trip every weekend, helped with my medical appointments, organized my medications, and provided companionship during the most difficult period of my life." Margaret was shaking with rage now, her carefully composed facade completely shattered. "She was isolating you, keeping you away from your real family so she could get her hands on your money." "Actually," Mr. Whitmore interjected, "Mrs. Carter specifically addressed that concern in her will. She includes detailed accounts of every visit from each family member over the past 2 years. Sarah visited 47 times. Jessica visited 8 times, usually when she needed something. Margaret, you visited 3 times. And Frank, you visited once, for last Christmas dinner." The numbers hung in the air like an accusation. 47 visits versus 8, 3, and 1. The mathematical proof of who had actually cared enough to show up. Jessica was crying now, but they were angry tears rather than sad ones. "This isn't fair. Sarah doesn't understand family dynamics. She doesn't have kids or a husband to worry about. It was easier for her to visit." "Easier?" I repeated, my own anger finally beginning to surface. It was easier for me to drive 6 hours every weekend while working 50-hour weeks. It was easier for me to sacrifice my social life, my dating prospects, and my financial security. How exactly was any of that easier? You know what I mean, Jessica snapped. You don't have the same responsibilities we do. You can afford to be the perfect granddaughter because you don't have a real life. There it was, the fundamental truth about how they saw me. I didn't have a real life because my life didn't look like theirs. I wasn't married, didn't have children, didn't own a house, so my time and money were somehow less valuable than theirs. The total value of the estate, Mr. Whitmore continued, is approximately $450,000. The number hit them like a physical blow. Margaret actually gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Frank's face went from red to gray in seconds. Jessica stopped crying and stared at me with naked hatred. $450,000. More money than any of them had ever imagined Grandma Ruth possessing. Money that they'd assumed would be split 4 ways, giving each of them over $100,000 to solve their financial problems. Instead, it was all mine. This has to be illegal, Margaret said desperately, turning to Mr. Whitmore. There must be some kind of law about fair distribution to family members. Sarah can't just steal our inheritance like this. Mrs. Collins, the lawyer said firmly, this will was prepared with full legal review and witnesses. Mrs. Carter was mentally competent and acting of her own free will. She has the absolute right to distribute her estate as she sees fit. Frank leaned forward, his voice taking on the wheedling tone he used when asking for money. Sarah, you have to see that this isn't right. Family takes care of family. Your grandmother was obviously confused at the end, and you took advantage of that confusion. I looked at each of their faces, red with anger, twisted with greed, ugly with entitlement. These were the people I'd spent 12 years trying to please, trying to help, trying to love, despite their consistent indifference to my well-being. You're right about one thing, I said quietly. Family should take care of family. But that's not what happened here. I took care of family, and family took me for granted. I opened my purse and pulled out the manila envelope containing my financial records. The papers made a soft rustling sound as I spread them across the mahogany table. You want to talk about what's fair? I continued, my voice growing stronger. Let's talk about fair. The reckoning had begun, and there was no going back. The financial records spread across the mahogany table like evidence at a trial. Bank statements, check stubs, money transfer receipts, and my handwritten ledger documenting every single transaction over the past 5 years. The papers caught the light streaming through the law office windows, creating a mosaic of numbers that told the story of my invisible sacrifice. Margaret stared at the documents with growing horror, her face cycling through shades of red and white as she recognized her own requests scattered among the evidence. Frank reached for one of the bank statements with a shaking hand, his eyes scanning the monthly transfers that had kept his creditors at bay. Jessica remained frozen in her chair, her perfectly manicured fingers pressed against her lips, as if trying to hold back words that might incriminate her further. Let's start with the basics, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I picked up a summary sheet I'd prepared the night before. Frank, do you remember telling me your car needed emergency repairs last March? You said the transmission was failing, and you needed $800 immediately, or you'd lose your job because you couldn't get to work. Frank's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. The car did need repairs. I'm sure it did, I replied calmly. But according to the bank records from your local casino, you spent exactly $800 at the poker tables that same weekend. Interesting coincidence. Mr. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, watching the family dynamics unfold with the professional detachment of someone who'd seen similar scenes many times before. This wasn't his first inheritance dispute, and it wouldn't be his last. But I could see a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes as he watched me finally stand up for myself. Margaret found her voice, though it came out as a harsh whisper. You were spying on us? Investigating your own family like criminals? I was protecting myself, I corrected, and it turns out I was right to do so. I pulled out another document. Margaret, let's talk about your medical emergency in September. You called me crying, saying you needed $1,200 for dental work that wasn't covered by insurance. You said you were in terrible pain and couldn't eat." Margaret's face flushed crimson. "I was in pain. My tooth was—" "Your tooth was fine," I interrupted, holding up a credit card statement. "But your QVC account shows a $1,200 purchase the next day. A complete set of crystal figurines and a jewelry organizer. For someone who couldn't eat, you certainly managed to shop." Jessica finally spoke, her voice small and defensive. "Sarah, you don't understand. We never asked you to keep track of everything like this. If we had known you were—" "You would have what?" I cut her off. "Been more careful about lying to me? Found better excuses for why you needed money? Jessica, in the past 18 months, you've told me you needed money for car repairs, medical bills, your wedding anniversary dinner, Christmas presents for your kids, and legal fees for your work situation. Every single time, you promised to pay me back as soon as things got better." I spread out a series of bank statements showing transfers to Jessica's account. But here's what actually happened to that money. The car repair money went to a spa weekend in Seattle. The medical bills funded a shopping spree at Nordstrom. The anniversary dinner money paid for a new designer handbag. The Christmas present money went to a jewelry store. And the legal fees? Those went to pay off your credit card debt from all the other purchases. Jessica's composure finally cracked completely. "How dare you spy on me like that? You're sick, Sarah. Normal people don't keep files on their family members. Normal families don't systematically lie to and financially exploit their relatives either," I shot back, my anger finally bubbling to the surface. "But apparently we're not a normal family." Frank slammed his hand on the table, making everyone jump. "Enough! This is exactly what I was afraid of. Sarah, you've let this money go to your head, and now you're attacking people who love you. Your grandmother would be ashamed of how you're acting right now." The mention of Grandma Ruth hit like a physical blow, but not in the way Frank intended. Instead of shame, I felt a surge of righteous anger that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside me. "Don't you dare," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare tell me what Grandma Ruth would think. You visited her exactly once in 2 years, Frank. Once. You showed up for Christmas dinner, ate the food I helped cook, accepted the presents I helped buy, and then disappeared for another 12 months. I turned to face all 3 of them, years of suppressed frustration finally finding its voice. "You want to know what Grandma Ruth really thought? She thought you were all taking advantage of me. She told me so, repeatedly during the months when I was the only one showing up to take care of her." Margaret stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I've heard enough of this nonsense. Sarah, you've clearly had some kind of psychological break, and you're rewriting history to make yourself feel important. But the truth is, you were always the weird one in this family. The one who couldn't make friends, couldn't find a husband, couldn't build a real life. So you attached yourself to Mother and tried to buy your way into feeling special." The words were designed to wound, and for a moment they did. But then I thought about Grandma Ruth's voice during our last conversation, weak but fierce. "You're worth more than all of them put together, sweetheart. Don't ever let them convince you otherwise." "You're right about one thing," I said quietly. "I couldn't build the life you have. I couldn't max out credit cards and expect someone else to pay the bills. I couldn't lie about emergencies to fund shopping sprees. I couldn't ignore a sick elderly woman while pretending to be a devoted daughter. I couldn't do any of those things, because I have something you 3 never developed: integrity." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat gently. "If I may," he said, "there's more to Mrs. Carter's will that you haven't heard yet." Margaret whirled to face him. "More? What else could there possibly be?" The lawyer turned to a section near the back of the document. Mrs. Carter included specific instructions regarding any attempts to contest this will. She was quite thorough in her preparations. He began reading again. "I am aware that my decision to leave the majority of my estate to Sarah may cause distress among other family members. However, I want it clearly understood that any attempts to contest this will or harass Sarah regarding her inheritance will result in the immediate activation of certain safeguards I have put in place." Frank leaned forward, his face suspicious. "What kind of safeguards?" Mr. Whitmore consulted another document. Mrs. Carter retained the services of a private investigator over the past year to document various irregularities in family financial behavior. She has compiled extensive evidence of fraud, including false claims about emergency medical expenses, unauthorized use of funds intended for specific purposes, and patterns of deceptive behavior regarding loan repayment. The color drained from Jessica's face. She hired a private investigator? That's paranoid behavior. She was clearly becoming senile. Actually, Mr. Whitmore continued calmly, the investigator's report confirms many of the concerns Mrs. Carter had expressed to me. She was protecting not only her own assets, but also ensuring that Sarah's generosity wasn't being systematically abused. He pulled out a thick manila folder from his briefcase. The report includes documentation of Frank's gambling activities, Margaret's fraudulent insurance claims, and Jessica's pattern of requesting money under false pretenses. Mrs. Carter's instructions were very clear. If anyone attempts to contest this will or retaliate against Sarah, all of this information will be turned over to the appropriate authorities. The threat hung in the air like a sword. Frank's gambling could be traced through casino records. Margaret's insurance fraud could result in criminal charges. Jessica's lies about medical emergencies while using the money for luxury purchases could constitute wire fraud. Margaret sank back into her chair, her face ashen. She was blackmailing us? She was protecting someone she loved, Mr. Whitmore corrected gently. Someone who had been protecting all of you for years without receiving any protection in return. Jessica turned to me with desperation in her eyes. Sarah, please. You have to understand. We never meant to hurt you. We got used to you being there. You were always so reliable, so willing to help. We thought you enjoyed being needed. The admission was simultaneously heartbreaking and infuriating. They had noticed my sacrifices. They'd just chosen to interpret them as evidence of my need to be useful, rather than recognition of my love for them. I did enjoy being needed, I said softly, but I wanted to be wanted too. I wanted to be valued for more than my ability to solve your financial problems. I wanted to be invited to dinner because you missed my company, not because you needed a favor. I wanted to be included in family decisions, not just informed after the fact that my money was required to implement them. Frank made one last desperate attempt at manipulation. Sarah, I know we haven't always shown it properly, but we do love you, your family. This inheritance, it's going to destroy our relationships. Is money really worth losing your family over? The question revealed everything wrong with their understanding of our situation. In their minds, I was choosing money over family. They couldn't see that they had been choosing money over family for years. They'd just been choosing my money. I'm not losing my family over money, I replied. I lost my family to money years ago. I just didn't realize it until now. I began gathering my financial records, stacking them neatly into the manila envelope. The weight of the evidence felt different now. Not like a burden I was carrying, but like proof of my own worth. For 12 years I've been trying to earn your love by giving you everything I had, I continued, standing up from the table. I thought if I just helped enough, sacrificed enough, proved myself enough, you'd eventually see me as an equal member of this family instead of a convenient resource. I looked at each of their faces. Frank's calculating desperation, Margaret's bitter resentment, Jessica's wounded entitlement. But Grandma Ruth was right. I was never going to earn something you were never willing to give. Margaret made one final attempt to regain control. Sarah, you're making a terrible mistake. Family is all we have in this world. When you're old and alone, we're the ones who would have taken care of you. Now what do you have? Money? Money can't love you back. I touched the gold locket at my throat, feeling the weight of 4 generations of strong women who had loved unconditionally, but hadn't accepted being treated as disposable. You're wrong, I said quietly. I have something much more valuable than money. I have self-respect. I have the knowledge that I loved completely and honestly, even when it wasn't returned. And I have the freedom to build a life based on what I want, not what other people need from me. I turned to Mr. Whitmore, who had been watching this family drama unfold with professional discretion. What do I need to do to take possession of the inheritance? We'll need to schedule another meeting to handle the paperwork and transfers, he replied. I'd suggest giving everyone some time to process today's revelations before we proceed with the practical matters. As I walked toward the door, Jessica called out one last time. "Sarah, please, don't let this be how our story ends. We can fix this. We can be a real family." I paused with my hand on the doorknob, considering her words. For a moment, I felt the familiar pull of hope, the desire to believe that this confrontation might finally lead to the genuine relationships I'd always wanted. But then I remembered the look in their eyes when they'd learned about the inheritance. Not joy for my good fortune, but fury at their own loss. Not concern for my well-being, but calculation about how to regain control over resources they'd never earned. "We were never a real family, Jessica," I said without turning around. "We were just an arrangement that worked well for three of us and cost everything for one of us." I opened the door and stepped into the bright October sunlight, leaving behind the cramped conference room and the people who had shaped my life for so long. For the first time in 12 years, I had nowhere I needed to be, no crisis I needed to solve, no one else's emergency to handle. I had only my own life to live, and I was finally ready to figure out what that meant. I sat in my Honda Civic outside the law office for 20 minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I watched my family emerge from the Victorian building. They huddled together on the sidewalk like conspirators, their voices carrying across the parking lot in sharp, angry fragments. I could see Margaret gesticulating wildly while Frank paced in tight circles, his face red with agitation. Jessica stood slightly apart from her parents, her phone pressed to her ear, probably calling her husband Tom to deliver the devastating news. None of them looked in my direction. After 12 years of being their safety net, their problem solver, their financial lifeline, I had become invisible to them in a completely different way. I was no longer useful, so I simply ceased to exist in their immediate reality. The irony wasn't lost on me. I started the engine and drove toward Portland, taking the scenic route along the Willamette River. The October afternoon was crisp and clear, with golden leaves spiraling down from the oak trees that lined the highway. For the first time in years, I wasn't mentally calculating how much gas money I could afford to spend, or whether I needed to hurry back for an evening shift to cover someone else's emergency expenses. My phone buzzed repeatedly with calls and texts, but I'd turned off the sound. I could see the notifications piling up on my lock screen. Missed calls from Jessica, voicemails from Margaret, text messages from Frank. The frantic attempts to re-establish contact now that they realized I held all the cards. But I wasn't ready to engage with their damage control efforts. Not yet. Instead, I drove to Laurelhurst Park and walked the familiar paths around the pond, watching families feed ducks and couples walking hand in hand. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal after the morning's revelations. While these people were living their ordinary Saturday lives, I had just inherited a small fortune and severed ties with the only family I'd ever known. I found an empty bench overlooking the water and finally allowed myself to process what had actually happened. $450,000. The number still felt abstract, like something that belonged to someone else's life. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app, half expecting to see the same modest checking account balance I'd carried for years. But Mr. Whitmore had been efficient. A preliminary transfer had already appeared, $50,000 to cover immediate expenses, while the larger estate transfer was processed. $50,000. More money than I'd ever seen in my account at one time. I thought about what this meant in practical terms. I could quit my job at the hospital laboratory, though I wasn't sure I wanted to. I could buy a house, travel, go back to school, start a business. The possibilities stretched out before me like an unexplored country, both thrilling and terrifying. More importantly, I could stop living paycheck to paycheck for the first time since my parents died. I could stop calculating whether I could afford groceries after sending money home. I could stop working double shifts to cover other people's emergencies. I could stop making every life decision based on my family's needs. The freedom was overwhelming. My phone rang again, and this time I glanced at the screen. Jessica's name appeared with a photo from last Christmas, the one where I'd helped coordinate and fund the entire family gathering, while she took credit for the beautiful table setting I'd spent hours arranging. I answered on the fourth ring. "Sarah!" Jessica's voice was breathless with relief. "Thank God you picked up. We need to talk. This whole situation has gotten completely out of hand." "Has it?" I asked mildly, watching a mallard duck paddle across the pond with her ducklings trailing behind in a perfect line. Yes. Look, I know we didn't handle things well in the lawyer's office. Mom was upset, Dad was confused, and we all said things we didn't mean. But we're family, Sarah. We can work through this. The word family rang differently now. For 12 years, it had been my anchor, my motivation, my excuse for every sacrifice. Now it sounded like a manipulation tactic. What exactly do you think we need to work through? I asked. Jessica's voice took on the carefully modulated tone she used when trying to manage difficult situations. Well, obviously, this inheritance has created some tension, but I've been thinking about what Grandma Ruth really would have wanted, and I don't think she intended to divide the family like this. Really? Because her will seemed pretty clear about her intentions. Sarah, you have to understand, Grandma was elderly and sick. She probably didn't fully grasp the implications of what she was doing. I mean, leaving everything to one person when there are other family members who need help? That doesn't sound like the grandmother we knew. I almost laughed at the audacity. Jessica was essentially arguing that Grandma Ruth was too senile to recognize their financial abuse, despite the extensive documentation proving otherwise. The grandmother you knew, I repeated. Jessica, when was the last time you spent more than an hour alone with Grandma Ruth? Silence stretched across the line. I could practically hear Jessica's mental calculations as she tried to come up with an answer that wouldn't incriminate her further. I was busy with work and my marriage, she said finally, but that doesn't mean I didn't love her. We all loved her in our own ways. Love, I said, tasting the word. Is that what you call asking her for money every time you visited? Is that what you call showing up to family dinners only when you needed something? That's not fair, Sarah. Not all of us can structure our entire lives around one person. Some of us have broader responsibilities. There it was again, the implication that my life was somehow smaller and less important than theirs. That my time and energy were less valuable because I didn't have a husband or children to justify my choices. You're right, I said quietly. Some of us do have broader responsibilities. I had responsibility for keeping this entire family financially afloat while you pursued your quote, broader interests. Jessica's composure cracked slightly. Look, if this is about money, we can figure something out. Maybe we can set up some kind of payment plan to compensate you for whatever you think you're owed. Whatever I think I'm owed, as if my documented sacrifices were just my opinion rather than mathematical reality. This isn't about being compensated, Jessica. This is about being valued. And you can't set up a payment plan for 12 years of being taken for granted. Sarah, please. You're letting hurt feelings cloud your judgment. Think about this logically. You're 28 years old with no dependents, no mortgage, no major expenses. Mom and Dad are struggling. I have student loans and a household to maintain. We need this money more than you do. The entitlement was breathtaking. Even after being confronted with evidence of their systematic deception, Jessica still believed they deserved Grandma Ruth's inheritance more than I did, simply because their financial problems were more visible. You need money that isn't yours, I corrected, money that Grandma Ruth specifically chose not to leave to you. She was manipulated. Jessica's voice rose sharply. You isolated her from the family and filled her head with lies about us. You took advantage of a sick old woman. The accusation hung between us like a challenge. For a moment, I felt the familiar urge to defend myself, to explain and justify and try to make her understand. But then I remembered Mr. Whitmore reading Grandma Ruth's detailed observations about family visits, her careful documentation of financial requests, her clear-eyed assessment of who actually cared about her well-being. Jessica, I said calmly, if spending time with Grandma Ruth and helping with her care constitutes manipulation, then I'm guilty as charged. If being there for someone who needed companionship makes me a predator, then that's what I am. But if that's your definition of manipulation, what does that make 12 years of lying to me about emergencies so you could fund shopping sprees? Another long silence. I could hear traffic in the background and realized Jessica was probably calling from her car, maybe sitting in her own parking lot trying to regroup after the morning's disasters. We never meant to hurt you, she said finally, and for the first time her voice sounded genuinely small. We just We got used to you being there. You were always so competent, so reliable. We thought you were okay with helping." "I was okay with helping," I replied. I was not okay with being lied to, taken for granted, and treated like an ATM instead of a family member. "So what now?" Jessica asked. "You keep all the money and we just, what, never speak again?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been avoiding since walking out of the law office. What did I want from this situation? Revenge? Vindication? A genuine apology and changed behavior? Or was I simply ready to walk away from relationships that had never served me? "I don't know," I admitted. "But I do know that whatever happens next has to be different from what happened before. I'm not going back to being the family bank account." "Sarah, we can change. We can do better. Just, please don't let this be the end of our relationship. I know we haven't always appreciated you the way we should have, but you're important to us." Important to them. The phrase should have felt validating, but instead, it felt hollow. I was important to them the way a credit card was important. Useful when needed, forgotten when not. "I need time," I said finally. "This whole situation. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not constantly worried about everyone else's problems." "How much time?" "I don't know, Jessica. Maybe a lot of time." I could hear her crying now, quiet sobs that might have been genuine or might have been calculated for maximum emotional impact. With Jessica, it was always hard to tell. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "We're all sorry. We never meant for things to get this bad." "I believe you never meant for me to find out," I said gently. "But that's not the same thing." After I ended the call, I sat on the park bench for another hour, watching the light change as afternoon melted into evening. Families packed up their picnic supplies and headed home to dinner preparations and homework supervision, and all the ordinary dramas of domestic life. For the first time in years, I had no pressing obligations waiting for me. No family crisis to solve, no emergency transfer to arrange, no guilt about spending money on myself instead of sending it home. The silence felt foreign, like suddenly finding yourself in a room where a clock you hadn't realized was ticking had finally stopped. I drove back to my apartment as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. My neighbors were settling in for Saturday evening. I could see the blue glow of televisions through windows, smell dinner cooking, hear children laughing in the playground behind the building. My own apartment felt different when I unlocked the door. The same second-hand furniture, the same small rooms, the same view of the parking lot. But something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just the place where I lived while serving other people's needs. This was the starting point for whatever came next. I made myself a simple dinner and sat at my tiny kitchen table, looking through the papers Mr. Whitmore had given me. Bank account numbers, investment portfolios, insurance policies, the building blocks of a new life I'd never imagined possible. But more than the money, I had something I'd never possessed before: complete autonomy over my own choices. No one else's emergency could override my plans. No one else's crisis could derail my goals. No one else's opinion could dictate how I spent my time, energy, or resources. The responsibility was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. My phone buzzed with another text message, this one from Margaret. "Sarah, we need to discuss this situation like adults. Can you please call me back?" I deleted the message without responding. There would be time for more conversations later, if I decided there should be. But tonight, I wanted to sit in the silence of my own life and imagine what it might become when it was truly mine to shape. Outside my window, Portland glittered in the darkness, full of possibilities I'd never allowed myself to consider. Tomorrow, I would start exploring them. Tonight, I would simply enjoy the unprecedented luxury of having no one to take care of but myself. For the first time in 12 years, that felt like enough. 3 weeks after the will reading, I stood in the lobby of Portland General Hospital at 6:47 a.m., holding a letter of resignation that felt both liberating and terrifying. The familiar smell of disinfectant and floor wax surrounded me as I watched the early shift arrive. Nurses clutching coffee cups, doctors reviewing charts, and laboratory technicians like myself heading to another day of routine blood draws and specimen analysis. For 6 years, this had been my world. Predictable, scientific, contained. I knew exactly what each day would bring, arriving at 7 a.m., processing samples until 3 p.m., occasionally staying late when emergencies arose. The work was methodical and satisfying in its precision, but it had also been a safe harbor where I could hide from the bigger questions about what I actually wanted from life. Now, with Grandma Ruth's inheritance providing financial security I'd never imagined possible, those questions could no longer be avoided. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, the lab director, emerged from her office with the harried expression she wore every Monday morning. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd built the laboratory's reputation through sheer competence and determination. She'd also been one of the few people at the hospital who'd noticed when I consistently picked up extra shifts, though she'd never asked why. "Sarah," she called out, spotting me near the reception desk. "Perfect timing. I was hoping to catch you early. We've got a situation with the weekend backlog, and I was wondering if you could stay late tonight to help clear it." I looked down at the resignation letter in my hands, thinking about how many times I'd said yes to exactly this kind of request, how many evenings I'd spent in the fluorescent-lit laboratory while my coworkers went home to families and social lives, how many weekend shifts I'd accepted to earn the extra money my family always seemed to need. "Actually, Dr. Reynolds, I need to talk to you about something." She must have heard something in my tone because her expression shifted from distracted efficiency to focused attention. "Of course, come into my office." Her office was a small, cluttered space overlooking the hospital parking garage. Medical journals were stacked on every available surface, and her desk was covered with requisition forms and budget reports. She gestured for me to sit in the chair across from her desk while she settled behind a computer monitor that had seen better days. "What's on your mind, Sarah? You look like someone with something important to say." I handed her the letter, watching her face as she scanned the formal language of resignation. Her eyebrows rose progressively higher as she read. 2 weeks' notice, she said finally, looking up at me with surprise. "Sarah, this is very sudden. Is there a problem here? Has someone been treating you poorly? Because if there's an issue we can address—" "No, nothing like that," I interrupted quickly. "Everyone here has been wonderful. This is about personal circumstances, family situation." Dr. Reynolds leaned back in her chair, studying my face with the same analytical approach she brought to laboratory results. "Family situation. That's interesting phrasing. In my experience, family situations usually require more money, not less, but you're quitting a stable job with good benefits." I found myself smiling despite the seriousness of the conversation. It's complicated. Most important things are. She set the letter down and folded her hands. "Sarah, you've been one of our most reliable technicians for 6 years. You never call in sick, you always volunteer for extra shifts, and you do excellent work. But I've also noticed that you seem to carry a lot of weight on your shoulders for someone your age. Whatever this family situation is, I hope it's giving you something positive for once." The kindness in her voice caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on the logistics of resignation, finishing projects, training replacements, maintaining professional relationships, that I hadn't expected anyone to notice the emotional aspects of my decision. "Thank you," I said quietly. "It is, actually. For the first time in years, it really is." Dr. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. "Well, if you ever decide you want to come back, you'll always have a place here. Good laboratory technicians are hard to find, but good people are even rarer." As I walked out of the hospital for what might be the last time as an employee, I felt a strange mixture of loss and anticipation. This job had been my anchor through years of family chaos, providing both financial stability and a sense of professional identity that existed separately from my role as the family problem solver. But it had also been a limitation, keeping me safely contained in a life that was smaller than what I might have chosen if I'd ever felt free to choose. My phone had been buzzing steadily for the past 3 weeks, with increasingly desperate attempts at contact from my family. The messages had evolved through several distinct phases: initial shock and anger, followed by bargaining attempts, then guilt-inducing appeals to family loyalty, and finally veiled threats about legal action and public embarrassment. Frank's latest voicemail, left at 2:17 a.m. the previous night, had been particularly revealing. "Sarah, this is getting ridiculous. Margaret's talking about hiring a lawyer to contest the will, and Jessica's husband thinks we should go to the media about elder abuse. None of us want to do that, but you're forcing our hand here. Just call us back so we can work something out like reasonable adults." The threat was both laughable and infuriating. They were the ones who had systematically deceived me for years, but somehow I was the unreasonable one for refusing to continue funding their lifestyle. More importantly, they seemed to genuinely believe that threatening me would somehow restore the power dynamic that had governed our relationship for so long. But the most disturbing aspect of their campaign was how quickly they'd moved from denial to aggression. In their minds, I had somehow stolen something that rightfully belonged to them, despite the fact that Grandma Ruth's money had never been theirs to begin with. I drove home through Portland's Monday morning traffic, listening to a podcast about starting small businesses instead of my usual true crime shows. The change felt symbolic. I was finally allowing myself to imagine creating something, instead of just analyzing what had already gone wrong. My apartment felt different now that I knew I'd be leaving soon. I'd started looking at houses the previous week, something that would have been impossible on my hospital salary but was now well within reach. The freedom to make decisions based on what I wanted, rather than what I could afford, was still startling after years of constant financial calculation. I was researching mortgage rates on my laptop when someone knocked on my door. The knock was sharp and insistent, with the rhythm of someone who expected immediate compliance. I peered through the peephole and felt my stomach drop. Margaret stood in the hallway wearing her serious business outfit, the black blazer she reserved for parent-teacher conferences and other occasions when she needed to project authority. Her face was set in the expression of grim determination I remembered from childhood confrontations about homework and household rules. I considered not answering, but something about her posture suggested she'd keep knocking until I did. I opened the door but left the security chain attached, creating a gap just wide enough for conversation. "Hello, Margaret." "Sarah." Her voice was clipped and cold. "We need to talk. May I come in?" "I'm comfortable talking like this." Her eyes flashed with irritation. "Fine. I drove 3 hours to have this conversation, so let's have it. This situation has gone on long enough." "Which situation is that?" "Don't be obtuse. You know exactly what I'm talking about. This inheritance nonsense has gotten completely out of hand, and it's time for you to start acting like an adult." The irony of being lectured about adult behavior by someone who'd spent years lying about medical emergencies to fund shopping addiction was rich, but I kept my expression neutral. "What specifically would you like me to do?" Margaret shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable with having this conversation through a partially opened door. "Look, I understand that you're hurt about some things that happened in the past. Maybe we didn't always handle family finances in the most organized way. But this inheritance situation is destroying our family." "Destroying your finances," I corrected. "There's a difference." Her composure cracked slightly. "Sarah, Frank lost his job last week. The casino thing. It came out at work and they fired him for gambling on company computers. We can't make our mortgage payment without your help." I felt a familiar stab of guilt, followed immediately by anger at my own reaction. Frank's gambling addiction wasn't my responsibility to manage or fund. His job loss was a consequence of choices he'd made repeatedly despite having multiple opportunities to get help. "I'm sorry that happened," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure how it involves me." "How it involves you?" Margaret's voice rose sharply. "Sarah, we're family. When family members are in trouble, other family members help. That's how families work." "Is it?" I asked. Because I was in trouble for 12 years, financially struggling, emotionally isolated, working myself to exhaustion, and nobody seemed to think family obligation applied then. Margaret's face flushed red. "That's completely different. You were young and single with no real responsibilities. We have a mortgage, car payments, insurance premiums, adult obligations that you don't understand because you've never had to deal with them." The condescension was breathtaking. She was dismissing years of my financial sacrifice, while simultaneously demanding that I resume making those sacrifices to solve problems she'd helped create. "Margaret," I said quietly, "I understand adult obligations better than you think. I've been meeting my own obligations plus subsidizing yours for most of my adult life. But that arrangement is over now." "Over?" She stared at me as if I'd announced my intention to join a cult. "Sarah, you can't just abandon your family because you inherited some money. That money should be shared. Mother would have wanted it shared." Mother left a very detailed will explaining exactly how she wanted her money distributed. If she'd wanted it shared equally, she would have written it that way. Margaret's mask of reasonableness finally fell away completely. Your grandmother was a sick old woman who was manipulated by someone she trusted. You took advantage of her loneliness and confusion to steal money that should have gone to her actual family. The accusation hung between us like a gauntlet thrown down. For years I'd absorbed their criticism and demands because I'd believed, on some level, that their needs were more legitimate than mine. But standing in my own doorway, looking at the fury and entitlement on Margaret's face, I finally saw the situation clearly. "Margaret," I said calmly, "if taking care of someone you love constitutes manipulation, then yes, I manipulated her. If showing up when someone needs you makes you a thief, then I'm guilty. If being there for family members without expecting anything in return is somehow wrong, then I've been wrong for 12 years. I paused, watching her face cycle through anger, confusion, and something that might have been shame. "But if that's your definition of family loyalty," I continued, "then what do you call lying about medical emergencies to fund shopping sprees? What do you call borrowing money under false pretenses and never paying it back? What do you call treating a family member like an ATM for over a decade?" Margaret opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time in our conversation, she seemed to realize that her moral authority might not be as solid as she'd assumed. "This isn't over," she said finally, her voice tight with controlled fury. "We're going to contest this will. We have evidence of undue influence and financial manipulation. You won't get away with stealing from your own family." "Good luck with that," I replied evenly. Mr. Whitmore mentioned that Grandma Ruth anticipated legal challenges. I believe she prepared extensively for them. Margaret's face went pale as she remembered the private investigator's report and the detailed documentation of their financial deceptions. Whatever lawyer they consulted would quickly realize that contesting the will would expose them to far more legal jeopardy than they faced by accepting it. "You've changed," she said, and for the first time her voice carried something other than anger. "You used to care about family. You used to understand that we needed to stick together." "No," I corrected gently. "I used to believe that caring about family meant accepting whatever treatment you chose to give me. I used to think that sticking together meant I should make myself smaller so you could feel bigger. But caring about family should work both ways, and it never did with us." I started to close the door, then paused. "Margaret, I hope Frank gets help for his gambling addiction. I hope you find a way to manage your finances without relying on other people's money. I hope Jessica builds a career she can be proud of, without cutting corners. I genuinely want good things for all of you." "But," she said bitterly, "but I'm not going to sacrifice my life to make your lives easier anymore. That arrangement never worked for me, and it clearly didn't teach any of you to solve your own problems." I closed the door and engaged all 3 locks, listening to Margaret's footsteps retreat down the hallway. Through my window, I watched her get into Frank's aging pickup truck, probably because her car had been repossessed, and drive away with the defeated posture of someone who'd played their last card and lost. For the first time since inheriting Grandma Ruth's estate, I felt truly free. Not just financially free, but emotionally liberated from the weight of their expectations and demands. I was no longer the family scapegoat, the eternal problem solver, the invisible safety net. I was just Sarah, with a substantial inheritance and an entire life ahead of me to figure out who I wanted to be when nobody else's crisis could define my choices. The possibilities stretched out before me like an uncharted map, and for the first time in 12 years, I was excited to explore them. 6 months later, I stood in the garden of Grandma Ruth's house, my house now, watching the first spring bulbs push through the soil she'd planted the previous fall. The daffodils were already blooming in cheerful yellow clusters, and the tulip buds showed promising hints of red and purple. She'd planned this garden knowing she wouldn't see it bloom, a final gift to whoever would love this place after she was gone. The house had undergone significant changes since I'd moved in during January. The outdated wallpaper in the kitchen had been replaced with warm sage green paint, and I'd opened up the wall between the living room and dining area to create the bright, open space Grandma Ruth had always wanted but never felt wealthy enough to achieve. The bedrooms had been converted into a home office and an art studio, spaces for the photography business I'd started, and the watercolor painting I'd discovered I loved. But the most important changes were invisible. This house no longer felt like a shrine to the past or a burden to maintain. It had become a home that reflected my own choices, my own dreams, my own vision of what life could be when it wasn't constantly constrained by other people's emergencies. I was planting new rose bushes along the back fence when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Jessica's name, which still appeared occasionally despite my consistent lack of response. I'd stopped answering their calls months ago, but I still checked the voicemails to monitor whether their tactics were escalating into anything that might require legal intervention. This time, however, something made me answer. "Hello, Jessica." "Sarah," her voice carried surprise and relief. "I can't believe you actually picked up. I was starting to think you'd changed your number." "I thought about it," I admitted, pulling off my gardening gloves and settling onto the porch swing Grandma Ruth had loved. "What do you want?" I wanted to talk to you. To apologize, actually. Really apologize, not just try to fix things so we could get money from you." I remained silent, waiting to see where this conversation would lead. Jessica's apologies in the past had typically been strategic, designed to restore access rather than acknowledge genuine wrongdoing. "I've been going to therapy," she continued, her voice smaller than usual. "After everything that happened with the will, my marriage started falling apart. Tom was furious that we didn't get any inheritance money, and he kept pushing me to find ways to pressure you into sharing it. When I wouldn't do that anymore, he showed me who he really was." This was new information. In all their previous attempts at reconciliation, no one had mentioned therapy or marriage problems or any kind of self-reflection about their behavior. "I'm sorry your marriage is having problems," I said carefully. "Actually, it's over. I filed for divorce last month." Jessica's voice was steadier now, as if she'd practiced this part of the conversation. "And honestly, it's been a relief. I spent so much time trying to maintain this perfect image, the perfect marriage, the perfect career, the perfect family dynamics, that I lost track of who I actually was underneath all that performance." I watched a cardinal land on the bird feeder I'd hung from the oak tree, remembering how Grandma Ruth had loved identifying the different species that visited her yard. "What does this have to do with me?" I asked. "Everything, I think. Sarah, I owe you an apology that I've never really given you. Not just for the money stuff, though that was terrible, but for treating you like you were less important than the rest of us. Like your life didn't matter as much because it looked different from ours." The admission was so unexpected that I felt tears spring to my eyes. In 6 months of processing everything that had happened, I'd prepared myself for continued manipulation, legal threats, and emotional blackmail. I hadn't prepared for genuine accountability. "I've been thinking about all those years you helped us," Jessica continued. "Not just the money, but the time, the energy, the emotional support. And I realized that we never once asked what you needed, what you wanted, what would make you happy. We just took and took until there was nothing left for you to give." I closed my eyes, feeling the afternoon sun warm on my face. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because my therapist helped me understand that I can't build a healthy life on a foundation of relationships where I used people instead of loving them. And because I miss you, Sarah. I miss my cousin who always showed up for everyone else. But more than that, I miss the opportunity to show up for you." "It's been 6 months, Jessica. Where was this realization when Margaret was threatening to contest the will? Where was this apology when Frank was leaving drunk voicemails calling me selfish?" "You're right. I was still trying to get what I wanted instead of dealing with what I'd done. But Sarah, I'm not calling to ask for money or to try to repair our relationship so I can benefit from it. I'm calling because I wanted you to know that I finally understand what we did to you, and I'm genuinely sorry." I stood up from the porch swing and walked to the edge of the garden, where Grandma Ruth's roses were beginning to show new growth. The silence stretched between us, filled with 12 years of complicated history and 6 months of necessary distance. "How are Mom and Dad handling everything?" I asked, finally. Jessica sighed heavily. "Not well. Dad's gambling got worse after he lost his job, and Mom's been enabling him instead of dealing with her own spending problems. They had to sell the house last month and move into a small apartment. They're both angry, but they're angry at each other now instead of just at you. And you? How are you handling everything? It's been hard, really hard, but also liberating. I got a second job to pay my own bills instead of relying on family money. I'm living in a smaller place, driving an older car, buying my clothes at thrift stores instead of department stores. And you know what? I'm happier than I've been in years. There was something in her voice that I'd never heard before, a quiet pride that came from solving her own problems instead of expecting someone else to solve them for her. I'm glad you're finding your way, I said and meant it. Sarah, I don't expect you to forgive me or trust me or want to have a relationship with me again. But I wanted you to know that inheriting Grandma's money wasn't the worst thing that happened to our family. It was the best thing, because it forced all of us to finally look at who we really were instead of pretending to be people we weren't. I thought about the past 6 months of my own life, the terror and excitement of starting my own business, the satisfaction of creating a home that reflected my own taste, the gradual process of building friendships with people who knew me as Sarah the photographer rather than Sarah the family problem solver. Have you been to her grave? I asked. Grandma's? No, I wasn't sure I had the right, after everything. She's buried in Sunset Memorial, Section C, Plot 47. There's a beautiful headstone now with her favorite Bible verse. I think she'd like visitors. Jessica was quiet for a long moment. Would you mind if I went? It's not my decision to make. She loved you, Jessica. She loved all of us. That's why she left such detailed instructions about how to distribute her estate. She wanted to protect the people she loved, even from themselves. She was protecting you from us. Yes, but she was also protecting you from yourselves. Look at what's happened. You're in therapy. You're learning to be self-sufficient. You're building a life based on your own capabilities instead of other people's resources. Dad's gambling addiction is finally out in the open, where it can be addressed. Mom's shopping problems can't be hidden anymore. These are painful changes, but they're necessary ones. I walked back to the porch swing and sat down, looking out at the garden that was coming back to life after winter's dormancy. Sarah, Jessica said quietly, is there any possibility that someday we could have coffee? Not to ask for anything, not to try to fix the family dynamics, just to be cousins again. It was the question I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, to restore some version of the family connections that had shaped my entire life. But a larger part of me knew that any relationship we rebuilt would have to be fundamentally different from what came before. Maybe, I said finally. But it would have to be different, Jessica. I can't go back to being the person who solves everyone else's problems and never has any of her own. I can't go back to being taken for granted. I wouldn't want you to. The person you were before, we never let you be yourself, did we? We needed you to be our safety net. So we never asked who you actually were underneath all that responsibility. Who am I? I asked, more to myself than to her. I don't know, Jessica admitted, but I'd like to find out, if you'll let me. After we ended the call, I sat on the porch swing until the sun began to set, watching the shadows lengthen across the garden. The cardinal returned to the bird feeder, this time accompanied by his mate, and I smiled thinking about how Grandma Ruth would have delighted in pointing out their different markings. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, the photographer whose studio I'd been apprenticing with since starting my business. He was inviting me to a gallery opening downtown, and for a moment I considered declining out of habit. The old Sarah would have worried about the cost, the time away from work, the social energy required to meet new people. But I wasn't the old Sarah anymore. I was someone who could afford gallery tickets, who had time for cultural events, who was learning to build relationships based on shared interests rather than mutual need. I texted back my acceptance and went inside to choose something to wear from the wardrobe I'd been slowly building, clothes chosen for how they made me feel rather than how much they cost or whether they were practical enough to justify the expense. As I got ready for the evening, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror and was surprised by what I saw. The fine lines around my eyes were still there, but they seemed to come from smiling now rather than worrying. My hair was longer and styled differently, framing a face that looked content. Not ecstatic, not perfectly happy, but fundamentally at peace in a way I'd never experienced before. The gold locket rested against my collarbone, catching the light from the bathroom fixtures. I opened it to look at my mother's photograph, thinking about the conversation with Jessica and the long journey that had brought me to this moment. "I think I'm finally becoming who you would have wanted me to be," I whispered to the tiny image. "Not someone who gives everything away to earn love, but someone who knows she's worth loving just as she is." I closed the locket and finished getting ready for the gallery opening, feeling excited about an evening that held no obligation except my own enjoyment. As I locked the front door of my house, my sanctuary, my home, I thought about Grandma Ruth's final gift. She hadn't just left me money. She'd left me permission to live my own life, to make my own choices, to be valued for who I was, rather than what I could provide for others. At her funeral, they had said I was nothing. But she had known better. She had seen everything I was capable of becoming when I finally stopped making myself small to fit into other people's expectations. And now, finally, I was becoming that person. The spring evening was mild and full of possibility as I drove toward downtown Portland, leaving behind the house where 4 generations of strong women had learned the difference between being needed and being valued. I was no longer nothing to anyone, because I had finally learned to be everything to myself. And that, I realized, was exactly what Grandma Ruth had always wanted for me. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money. It's the permission to choose yourself over obligation, to build a life based on your own worth rather than other people's needs, and to discover who you really are when you're no longer afraid of disappointing the people who never truly valued you in the first place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.